That's why I walked around Sunday with my arms like this, ready for the handcuffs. I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. That we would be sued for all kinds of terrible things, and the Times would be found guilty and pay such enormous fines, and the impact on our ability to do business and all kinds of things. Terrible, terrible things.
You interviewed Sulzberger from the New York Times. What was he thinking when all this is developing and he suddenly has access and knows his paper has the Pentagon Papers?
He had been told by the Times' historic lawyers, Lord Day and Lord, who included Herbert Brownell, who had been Attorney General for President Eisenhower in the 50s, that the publication of these documents would constitute a violation of the federal criminal law, in addition to being unpatriotic and bordering at least on the layman's version of treason. And so if he went around later in time saying, I actually thought I was going to go to jail, I think he had a good reason to believe that he was going to go to jail. They were also worried about civil liability. They were worried about the FBI breaking into the Times and collecting the documents or going to court and trying to get a prior restraint to stop publications.
What's going on inside the New York Times when they're debating whether or not to publish the Pentagon Papers?
They had been actually warned by Jim Goodale, who was the in-house general counsel at the Times, that although Jim did not think that the publication would violate the criminal law, he did think the government would have a plausible claim for getting a prior restraint. And in response to these opinions from their lawyers, Lord Day and Lord and Jim Goodale in-house, the Times actually took the whole preparation of the study out of the Times building and secretly rented rooms in the Hilton Hotel, a whole suite of rooms. And over a period of days and weeks, they slowly moved out the reporters and the editors that they needed to prepare the 10-part series to the Hilton Hotel. And kept the whole pre-publication process secret, even within the Times.
What was the inside counsel to the New York Times thinking about as they came to publication?
There was a huge fight within the Times over whether or not the Times should publish not only a news report based upon the government documents, but selective portions of the documents so that the public could see that the news reports actually were grounded substantially in the documents themselves. And Mr. Sulzberger was so conflicted about this matter that he did not make a decision about allowing the Abe Rosenthal, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, to publish the documents until Friday, June 11, 2 days before the series was beginning to run. So on Friday, the Times goes ahead, and Sulzberger, I think, is going to London, so the Times prepares itself to go ahead and publish it on Sunday, and they did.
I was struck in reading your book that when the news broke and the Pentagon Papers began to be published in the New York Times, folks at the White House were caught off guard.
Sunday was quiet. No, they didn't have to go back to the lawyers. Monday was quiet. They didn't have to go back to the lawyers. Monday night, they get a telegram from the Attorney General and said, if you don't cease and desist, we're going to sue you tomorrow morning in federal court. And it's at that moment that the Times calls Lord Day and Lord. And it's sometime on Monday night, June the 14th, 1971. And somewhere around 10 or 11 o'clock at night, Lord Day and Lord tells the New York Times through Jim Goodale, we're not going to be there tomorrow morning. So at that moment, he has to find another lawyer.
Floyd Abrams. It's off in the distance, and it's many years ago, but I hear your phone ringing.
Yes.
Do you remember your initial reaction at that time? And it must have been rather disconcerting to realize that the Times' own lawyers were using words like unpatriotic and didn't want to be involved.
Well, the call came about 1 in the morning. The Times had called Professor Alexander Bickel of the Yale Law School and then myself to work on the case. Jim Goodale did not tell us at that time that they had been told it was unpatriotic to publish. All he told me was that the matter involved the articles that I might have read in the paper the last few days, and that they had a telegram from Attorney General Mitchell, and he was demanding that they cease publication, and they weren't going to do that. And as one author later put it, it was like a member of the clergy being caught in a house of ill repute without a lawyer. And so at 1 in the morning, they called Professor Bickel and myself, and we went to my office and found the Espionage Act.
Well, now, I assume one of the things you were doing was trying to figure out what the Pentagon Papers were. I want to ask Les Gelb to help us here. Remind us in brief, what were the Pentagon Papers, and were you surprised when you learned that the Times was ready to publish?
Yeah, well, I was very surprised. Let me just say two things about what the Pentagon Papers were not. Despite popular notoriety, two things that they were not. One, they were not a definitive history of the Vietnam War. They always get portrayed that way, but they just weren't. They were a bunch of studies by people, many of whom had other jobs at the same time, who rushed them together based on documents that were made available. And we had a lot of documents from the Pentagon, and we had a lot of documents from the CIA, an assortment of things from the State Department. No internal White House memorandum unless they were shipped to the Pentagon. So we didn't have a lot of these things, a lot of the documents. It's not like WikiLeaks. So, and we didn't do any interviews, no interviews. So the representation of these papers as kind of the definitive history of the war is just nonsense. Secondly, the representation of these papers as being, in effect, the history of American lying, American officials lying to the public in order to get us involved in that war, was also incorrect. Of course there was lying. Governments always lie to advance their cause. But basically that story in the Pentagon Papers is a story of people who believed that Vietnam was kind of a cockpit of the Cold War, that the domino theory was real, and that it was going to take hold right there in Vietnam, and it had to be stopped there. That was the main motivation, rather than this is some secret conspiracy to have a war against the communists and lie to the American people about it. And no matter how many times I try to explain that, that isn't the way it gets said or written.
Now, Adam, I want you to take us into the newsroom. So help us frame the editorial thinking when something like this comes in.
All right, and you will bear in mind that I was 11 years old at the time.
It gives you perspective.
An enormous data dump as this was, particularly back in the day when you couldn't post it or selections from it, and the need to keep it secret, and the need to analyze an excerpt would be an enormous challenge, and then to try to put it in some kind of context to authenticate it. Just because it says so doesn't mean it is so. And the Times, I believe, both journalistically and then later legally, acted heroically in this instance, did a terrific job. I don't think anybody seriously contends that as Ellsberg wanted, that publication of the papers hastened the end of the war. But it did feed into a kind of distrust of government. But my point is, I guess, that it was in large part the decision to go after it that turned it into this radioactive taboo that perhaps it wasn't.
Well, hypothetically at the time, you're listening to this, you get a call that something like this is to be published. What goes through your head?
Well, two things. First of all, what's in it? And secondly, how does the law bear on that? And from what I've heard, what's in it doesn't sound as if it comes within the reach of the Espionage Act, although obviously that was one of the things that was considered, because that really relates to information that can be used directly to hurt the United States, and to if it causes death, can result in a death penalty. So I think it's easy for me to say now, of course, that had I been there, I might have counseled against the lawsuit, because I'm one of those people who believes, as many others do, that just as in criminal law, the cover-up is always worse than the crime. So it was with the Pentagon Papers. That is, the litigation, I think, was far more responsible for the durability of the issue than what was in the newspaper.
Does it strike you in that story you hear about 2 days of quiet? It's published 2 days. You don't hear anything until suddenly there's a. Now, what would have been going on for 2 days at the White House, do you think?
Obviously, there's a difference of opinion. Somebody is. Have you seen what the Times is doing? What do we do about it? How do we jump on those bastards? And I'm sure the word bastards would have been very much in the lexicon at the time, based on other things that I've seen published. And then there may very well have been a debate of the sort that I just suggested between people who either knew what was in it or took a good hard look at what was in it and said, look, you know, we're making more out of this than it's worth, and we could wind up losing, and there isn't anything that's going to result in a breach of national security. So why go to court?
Stephen Shapiro, let me bring you in, because the effort is to stop publication, but it didn't work.
But what I think is interesting and revealing about John's comment is that it has now become a process of negotiation. And the reason it has become a process of negotiation is because the Pentagon Papers decision largely took off the table the possibility of obtaining a prior restraint. If the government thought that they could obtain a prior restraint, modern technology permitting, I think they would continue to go to court to seek it. But that's simply not a realistic option anymore. So instead, what we have is a process of conversation between the government and the press.
Most of us who had some contact with the papers had the same initial reaction. We all believed that publication would harm American national security. We did. Now, I have to admit that X years later, I'm not sure when, I changed my mind, and so did most of the others. But at the time, if I would go through the litany of people involved, Bob McNamara, Clark Clifford, Mel Laird, the military assistants to the Secretary of Defense, Mort Halperin, myself, we were all worried about the harm it might do.
And can you define the harm for us?
No.
Well, in fairness,
let me tell you why. Let me just finish the thought.
Let him not define it for us first, and then.
Let me just finish the thought, because nothing like this had ever happened before. This was monumental, and this was all stuff many of us had worked on for years. The papers were so contemporaneous that they were memos we had written. And the thought of these all going out in public without our being able to look at those memos and make some judgment about what they would and wouldn't reveal, I think frightened us all. So the initial reaction was, as I described.
I have not read the Pentagon Papers, and I can imagine officials at the time saying how damaging they were. The problem is when we hear the story about the Pentagon Papers, it makes everybody think a little bit about Chicken Little, to say, well, listen to all of these people at the time swearing up and down about the damage that would be done. It wasn't true. In fact, they were really trying to protect the Pentagon Papers to cover governmental misdoing. We can never trust the government again. We can't trust future affidavits. And we'll get to this in WikiLeaks in a moment. But that doesn't mean that no bit of government information never causes damage, and that today there is sensitive government information that really does relate to actual sensitive sources. Not everything is improperly classified. So I'm not sure that the Pentagon Papers is in fact a lesson for all cases going forward, and we'll talk about the harm done by the release of 250,000 current State Department cables as the State Department is trying to currently go about its business.